Well, I wanted to talk about EU-wide tech policy and whether or not we should be using it to create the next Meta or Amazon or other evil giant tech company of your choice, because I am giving my bad week this week to a European tech product that was once a household name, Skype. I don't know if you've seen the news, Dominic, but the owner of Skype, Microsoft, has announced that it is killing off this once iconic internet telephone service. As of May the 5th, Skype will be no more. You must be very sad.
I am very sad. I mean, I haven't been using it for years, honestly. So, maybe it's just a bit of nostalgia that I'm feeling.
Yeah. I mean, it does raise the question of what we're going to do about the noise that we play before the interviews on this podcast. Because since the very beginning, we have used the Skype ringtone to signal that we're about to speak to a guest. Mm-hmm. Some people love it, some people hate it. During this mourning period for Skype, I read a quite beautiful tribute to the Skype ringtone by Michael Frischkopf, who is the director of the Canadian Centre for Ethnomusicology. And he points out that the Skype ringtone isn't really in either a major or a minor key. It's kind of both/neither. He told The Guardian it could sound happy or sad, which could represent the sadness of longing for someone and the joy of connecting with them.
That's weird. I don't know if I agree with him. I think the harmony implies a major key.
I think it implies minor. That's so interesting. This is like the dress that some people saw as gold and some people saw as blue. It's very obviously minor to me. Anyway, I thought that was a really unexpectedly poignant tribute. Full disclosure, it has been many years since we actually rang a guest on Skype. We have been using, like most of the world, other internet calling services, but we did keep the noise as a kind of retro tribute to the early days of the show. And personally, I'd be quite sad to see it go, even though quite a lot of our listeners would be, quite frankly, delighted, I think. For years, we've been getting emails from people saying, please get rid of the Skype noise. I hate it with a passion. Maybe now's the time to say goodbye.
If the Skype noise goes, I go.
Oh, wow. Okay. Big policy.
Well, no, I would be sad to see it go as well. And I think the fact that it's disappearing makes me feel even more inclined to keep it, just as a kind of retro throwback to our early days and to show how old this podcast is. Mm-hmm. But back to the serious news, because that is what this segment is, a serious news segment. Sure. Back to the closing down of Skype. Just to clarify, you've been describing Skype as a European tech product, but you also said it's owned by Microsoft. What makes it European? I
am describing Skype as European because it was invented in Europe. It was created by a group of tech bros, I guess you could say, from several countries, actually. Two of them from Estonia, one of them Danish, and one of them Swedish. Several of these programmers were also involved in bringing the world one of the earliest file-sharing programs, Kazaa, which might sound familiar if you too were a teenager interested in illegally downloading music in the early noughties.
Of course I wasn't.
Of course you weren't. Angel Child's Dominic Kramer. Anyway, Skype was founded in 2003 and quickly became the world's most popular program for calling people without using a phone. For free. You could hear your friend and see them on your computer screen through the magic of the internet, which is obviously something that many of us do every day these days. But back in 2003, when the world was still familiar with expensive long-distance phone calls, Skype was kind of revolutionary. It was a game changer for being able to have a long-distance relationship or talking to your relatives in a different country or whatever. And it also became kind of culturally important. Like there was a while where Oprah Winfrey would Skype people on her chat show. About 300 million people were using Skype at its peak. And obviously, at the same time, it became a huge, huge business. eBay bought Skype in 2005 for $2.6 billion.
Whoa.
And the company changed hands a few times in the following years, culminating in Microsoft buying it in 2011 for a whopping $8.5 billion. At the time, it was the most money Microsoft had ever spent buying anything. But Skype kept its headquarters in Luxembourg, resolutely European. It may or may not have something to do with the fact that Luxembourg is a rather tax-friendly location for hosting your giant tech company. And Skype continued to have a lot of its staff in Europe, in Estonia and Sweden, London and Berlin, despite, being owned by a US company, Microsoft.
But presumably the reason it's being shut down is that most people have just stopped using Skype in recent years and moved on to Zoom and other programs.
Indeed. That's a big part of the reason. It went from having 300 million users to around 23 million by 2020. One of the things that had made Skype different was that you could pay for credits that would allow you to ring a telephone from a computer. But these days, that's probably only useful for calling like a particularly tech-phobic grandparent who only has a landline phone or something like that. Because obviously a bunch of other platforms for calling people online have become available in recent years. Zoom, of course, emerged out of the pandemic as the queen of all the video call apps. And there are also plenty of competitors that were more consciously designed for use on our phones than Skype, like WhatsApp and FaceTime. A lot of these apps were also better at handling group calls than Skype was. Another part of the story, though, is that Microsoft bought Skype and then mysteriously kind of abandoned it. Like, they didn't really invest in keeping it relevant as a service. There were mounting complaints that it was buggy and didn't work properly. And in recent years especially, Microsoft have been focusing their efforts on developing Microsoft Teams, which is their main product aimed at rivaling Zoom as like the app of choice for remote work meetings. And indeed, that is the justification for shutting down Skype. Microsoft is basically like, Teams can do everything that Skype does and more. I will say that I absolutely hate Microsoft Teams.
So do I.
It's terrible. I don't think I've ever been able to straightforwardly join a Teams call without something going wrong. But it is certainly able to do stuff that Skype couldn't do well. Stuff like integrating with people's online calendars.
Although, honestly, Katie, I don't know if we've ever had a Zoom call together that hasn't required like 10 different attempts of each of us logging in.
Very true. Why is Zoom the world's most popular video call app? It just doesn't make sense. It's not very good. Please don't sue us, Zoom.
It's just your opinion.
Indeed.
It's funny, it's kind of difficult to think of that many tech brands that we use on a daily basis these days that actually come from Europe. I mean, Spotify is one of the only examples.
I mean, Spotify is still sort of Swedish in that the two biggest shareholders are still the two Swedes who created it, Daniel Ek and Martin Lorentzon. But they only own about a quarter of the shares. The rest are mostly held by big investment companies, a lot of which are based in the good old US of A. So even Spotify can't really be held up these days as a great example of a European tech innovation that has stayed truly European. And over the last couple of decades, really, as we've watched the world get taken over by the likes of Meta and Amazon, a lot of people have asked the question of why there isn't a European company among these super dominant global companies. I mean, a lot of other people have also asked if that's something that we really want, given that none of these companies is held up as being uncontroversially a force for good in the world. But at the same time, it's worth asking, right? You know, like, this is a rich continent with a really educated workforce. We do make a lot of tech stuff that isn't a household name, like, I don't know, specialist medical equipment or whatever. And in general, we have plenty of startups, but they just never seem to get that big. Why isn't there a European answer to Meta or Amazon? Just to give you some sense of the difference in scale that we're talking about between the size of the US tech industry and the size of the EU one, last year, according to Euronews, the total values of the shares of the top 7 tech companies in the EU was only about a 20th of the same figure for the top 7 US tech companies. So that is a huge difference. Our tech industry is teeny tiny compared to America's. And there have been various arguments put forward over the years as to why one of the biggest, baddest tech companies isn't European. One of them is that we have too many languages and legal systems, so that makes it hard to scale a tech company up in the same way that you're able to do in a mostly monolingual country like the US. Another is this theory that the reason that Silicon Valley flourished as a place where giant tech companies could be born is that local laws several decades ago made it easy for people to create businesses that then failed without them necessarily facing disastrous financial consequences. And that encouraged early pioneers, people like Steve Jobs, to take risks and innovate there in a way that would just be more financially costly here in Europe. And once those companies got big, various things about the US system just continued to allow them to concentrate power. So like, why did Skype get bought by eBay and later Microsoft? Maybe it's just because the US system allowed those companies to become massive in the first place and have the money to buy Skype in a way that would have been harder in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
A third argument is that there's just way more venture capital investment money in the US, about 20 times as much venture capital money, in fact. And that this cash mostly gets invested at home in the US because, it's easier for investors. They know what they're dealing with. And then there is, of course, perhaps the most popular argument, regulation.
That old chestnut.
That old chestnut. And there have been years of passionate debate about whether the weight of regulation in Europe makes it too hard to innovate here. Like, is it too hard to set up a business here in general, even on a national level, given all of the admin in lots of European countries, let alone on an EU level? Does the EU make it too hard to copyright an invention? Is there too much privacy regulation?
Yeah, well, a team of Republicans in the US definitely think so, don't they?
Apparently.
And actually, they seem to be particularly angry right now about a couple of fairly new but big EU internet laws that affect big US tech companies like Elon Musk's, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two massive pieces of tech-related regulation that came into force across the EU in 2022. They're called the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, and the Digital Services Act, or DSA. The DMA is largely aimed at stopping giant tech companies from abusing their power. And the DSA is mostly aimed at preventing misinformation and harmful content on the internet. So both very much aimed at protecting us, everyday internet users, much more than they protect the billionaire owners of platforms like Meta. And indeed, EU competition regulators have fined companies like Apple and Google billions of euros for abuses of market power. And Meta and X are both under investigation for failing to protect European internet users from online harm. So you can see why Musk et al. Don't really like our regulators. And this tension over all of the billions of dollars of fines and the investigations, that is something that has really been contributing to transatlantic tensions in recent weeks, along with the absolute car crash that was Trump's press conference with Zelensky and the US suspension of aid to Ukraine, and about 50 other things that feel like they've happened in the space of about 5 minutes. Trump has described the EU fines against Google and others as, quote, overseas extortion, which EU officials have hit back against. They've said, all we are doing is enforcing our laws. And we're not specifically targeting US companies in doing that. It just so happens that the world's largest tech companies are American. And if they've been misbehaving, we have a duty to make sure that they follow the rules that we've set. They've also pointed out that ByteDance, which owns TikTok, is also under investigation. And that's a Chinese company. So, it's not just US companies being targeted. All the same, things are really volatile right now. And the fact that a tech oligarch named Elon Musk appears to be making disturbingly large decisions for the US government right now, that makes it more likely that American anger at the way that we regulate tech companies over here, that can end up being a major justification for the Trump administration whacking big tariffs on European exports and basically saying, well, if you didn't want these tariffs, you shouldn't have gone after our Googles and our Metas.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that a lot of these fines are against US companies also just makes you realize quite how dependent we are on US tech at a time when being dependent on anything from the US maybe isn't such a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of anxious talk over the last couple of weeks about how dependent we Europeans are on US defense and how we need to not rely on the US to protect ourselves from Russia now that the US can't really be seen as a reliable friend on that front. And we're no doubt going to come back to the EU's 800 billion euro plan to rearm Europe because it is a huge deal that needs unpicking. But yeah, there is also a growing conversation about how dependent we are on US technology. and whether that might be dangerous in this more uncertain world that we find ourselves in. And I'm not talking about the kind of household name technology that, we use every day, the fact that we all buy a ton of stuff from Amazon or whatever. It's the less visible, more nerdy stuff, like the fact that a huge amount of European data is stored on the cloud via US companies. So there's been a lot more talk of late about tech sovereignty and how we need to strengthen our own artificial intelligence companies, our own data storage companies, our own microchip companies. All of these things are crucial to running the tech that we are so dependent on. Do we really want to be reliant on companies from the US or indeed other parts of the world, like in Asia, for all of this stuff, given that we're not sure where the world is going right now? Interestingly, in December, the European Commission appointed its first ever technological sovereignty chief, Henna Vilkkunen. She's from Finland. And there has also in recent weeks been a lot of talk about boosting AI in Europe. The European Commission announced this plan at the end of last year to invest 750 million euros in 7 different places across Europe for training supercomputers. These are these insanely powerful computers which can train the models that AI runs on. That seemed quite impressive at the time, but then the US casually announced that it was going to invest $500 billion in AI. Which made our 750 million euros look a little bit puny. So Ursula von der Leyen launched a new plan to try to raise 200 billion euros of investment for AI.
Okay.
A lot of which would presumably need to come from the private sector. So stuff is happening on this front. I feel like I've wandered quite far from Skype and the demise of its amazing ringtone.
Everything comes back to European defense and what Elon Musk is doing.
Yeah, there's one topic in town at the moment, unfortunately. I've wandered quite far from Skype, but I am going to wrap up by coming back to it because I feel like Skype is a symbol of something that we've seen repeatedly in recent decades, which is a great tech company that's been created in Europe. And then it gets bought by a US company because that's where the money is. And then we've both lost control of it and it has been left to languish. And that is kind of annoying from like a European pride point of view, right? But is it a bigger problem than that? And arguably it is. Not so much because the world won't survive without Skype, because of course there are a gazillion competitors. And it's also not necessarily sad that Skype didn't end up becoming this huge Amazon-style company that we could be proud of as a European export. It's a problem because of what it represents, this loss of control over a technological innovation in a world where having control of tech might end up being pretty crucial. So I do think this growing conversation about tech sovereignty is important. But it's not so much about having gargantuan household name companies like Google and Apple coming out of Europe. There's an apparently excellent book, which I'm afraid I haven't been able to read yet, but lots and lots of people recommend it. It's by Anu Bradford, and it's called The Brussels Effect. And it basically argues that even if our tech industry isn't that huge, the EU is having an outsized impact on the way that tech gets regulated worldwide. Because in a lot of cases, the way that we're designing bits of legislation like the DMA means that if companies have to comply here in Europe, it's easiest for them to just comply everywhere. Like in some cases, that's the only option, the only thing they can do. And that is powerful and probably a force for good in the world, since these laws are aimed at protecting ordinary internet users against bad behavior by giant companies. And maybe that is a more important kind of influence than being the home of the biggest, baddest tech companies in the world. Having said that, Ursula von der Leyen has said that she thinks we should launch a quote-unquote Buy European campaign when it comes to all of these new weapons that we're going to be buying. And we should be prioritizing buying stuff from European defense companies, providing that they can produce all of these guns and ammo and tanks fast enough.
Yeah, although just have to fact check that. I saw a really good thread on Blue Sky from Stanley Pignal pointing out that she quotes this statistic that 80% of weapons in Europe are bought from the US, and actually it seems to have been really badly sourced. And it's nothing like that. So Ursula, get your facts right.
We will be putting a link to that thread in the show notes. Thanks, Stanley. But Anyway, if we do this buy European thing, maybe the same should apply to tech, and we should be trying to use European tech companies when we can, like both to build up their businesses, because it's a nice thing to do, but also to exercise our strategic independence, even if it's as tiny little individual internet users.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier that we hate Zoom and you also hate Teams. And actually, we recently switched to a nice European website called Jitsi.
Oh, is it Jitsi? I've been saying Jitsi.
I don't know. Anyway, it's a free open source video conferencing piece of software. I think it was made by a student in France.
Yeah.
It's a Bulgarian guy, I think.
He was a Bulgarian student called Emil Ivov. He created it back in 2003 when he was an Erasmus student, actually, studying in Strasbourg in France. Apparently, he was also teaching swing dancing at the time.
Cute.
Busy guy. And it's really, really good. It's at least as good as Zoom, and hardly anyone seems to have heard of it. It's open source, as you say, which means that anyone can take the code and use it to develop new cool things, which is pretty cool. So yeah, heartily recommend Jitsi or whatever it's supposed to be called. On which note, I want to end this by drawing your attention to a great website that has been sent to us a few times in recent weeks, especially, which is the European Alternatives website. And you can use this website to find good alternative products to all of those tech things from the USA that you are so horribly addicted to. Your search engines and your email services, places to register a website address, even all kinds of stuff. You can find some really great European companies on there. And so you should definitely check it out. It is at european-alternatives.eu.
I'll check it out.